Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. And I'm really happy for you to get to know today Dr. Tiana Kelly. Welcome, Tiana.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here and, have some good conversation.
Yes, yes. And I think the topic people are going to find very interesting today. It's not something I've covered in a while, but just around compliance things. But before we get to that, tell folks a little bit more about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Tiana Kelly. I have a doctorate degree in prevention science. I'm also a practicing licensed professional counselor here in the state of Pennsylvania, working with Move Forward Counseling. We meaning Alison Pidgeon and I have kind of sidestepped a little bit and started doing some consulting work because as part of my role at Move Forward Counseling, I have taken on the compliance program, really kind of developed it and maintain it at this point in time. And so we're trying to branch out even further and help some other private practices with developing, their private practice as a whole, but also their compliance services.
Right, right. Well, I think as we were talking about, and that I'm so glad you're here, and because I think you're going to have a lot of knowledge to give us. But I think when I think of compliance, and probably most people think of compliance, is HIPAA, but also I'm sure there are other compliance issues. I'm thinking like employment issues, all of those kinds of things as well. But so tell us what do you feel like are important things for us to remember? Because I think when we think about compliance, people kind of get a little squirrely, as I like to say, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble with all this stuff if I don't comply. So yeah.
Yes, and you're so right. You hear that word compliance, or even, when I'm working with therapists in our practice, I can only imagine what it feels like to get an email from the compliance officer. I try to do a lot to offload the fear and just, for the most part, let everyone know, like, you're doing a good job. You've got this. But it's just that word, right? It's really fear loaded. But I think it is important to really consider how compliance is more than just HIPAA. And I agree with you. As I got started with this, I thought like I'd really be doing kind of like HIPAA 101 day in and day out in my compliance role, but it is so much more than that. Of course, it is HIPAA that is by and large what's driving a lot of our standards and requirements within our practices. But, it compliance really kind of sneaks its way into every element of our private practice, whether we like sit and think about it and acknowledge it or not. I mean, even just down to like policies and procedures and how those are written. And, do you have different procedures for instance, for therapists to follow, for clients to follow if there's a complaint, a grievance, like is all of that laid out? That's a piece of compliance. Documentation, that is a big piece of compliance and a
Mhm.
big piece that, every single day, whether you're the practice owner or the therapist, you're dealing with that. And then, to touch on like some of the HIPAA stuff, I would say, of course, like having an understanding of PHI and what we can do with it, what we can't do with it, what we need to do with it. For instance, if clients request access to their records, like it's the day in, day out operations. From admin is handling stuff with compliance, therapists, of course, are handling things with compliance, and then practice owners, for sure, are handling different areas of compliance.
Right, right. What would you say are some of the when we think about documentation, what are some of the essentials around compliance with just documentation, other than, keeping the information private and following the HIPAA guidelines and that kind of thing?
Yeah. One of the biggest things, and it seems like one of the easiest to control, but yet the hardest across the board for therapists is timeliness with our documentation. And we know how this goes, right? We get to the end of the workday and it's like, we had a day of talkers and we just couldn't get to the notes and I'm exhausted. And so I'm going to put them off until tomorrow. And then we start the day and we don't get yesterday's notes done and it just piles up and piles up and piles up. And we don't realize, I mean, just exactly what that could mean for the practice, right? Especially if you're an insurance-based practice, that could mean that practice does mean that practice is not getting paid if they're not able to submit for claims where notes aren't done. So that's a
Mhm.
big piece, that's within the control of therapists and to a degree within the control of the practice owners, right? Setting some policies around what's your time frame for when notes are to be completed. Typically 24 to 48 hours is what we see. Another big piece, though, is, and again, kind of sounds simple, but when we are moving throughout the day to day, we're moving too quickly often. Just like, okay, note is done. Let me admit the next client. Let me bring them, back from the waiting room. Proofreading, we move so quickly, and so much of the time when I'm in there doing chart audits, I catch such silly errors. And some of them, it's like, oh, okay, that would really just be a moot point. It's not a big deal. Some of it is like, oh, actually, in this note, you are misgendering the client, or it's not even the client's right name. And like that kind of stuff is pretty detrimental. If the client were to see that, what kind of upset would that cause? So proofreading, again, I think is a big mistake that comes up. That is something simple, easy, within our control. Takes, a couple extra seconds after you're finished the note to just take a glance at it and make sure it is as accurate as it can possibly be.
Mm-hmm.
And, if I had to list like kind of a third one, I would say this is more for like maybe the practice owner standpoint of things, though you could do this as a therapist for yourself in your own notes or your own documentation, like not doing chart audits, not going in there and seeing like what are the trends amongst your therapists, and what are their weak points, what are their strong points, where do we maybe need to offer more training or consultation around to make sure that we're hitting all of the areas that our payers or that HIPAA are requiring of us.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, and I think one of the things too that, and I don't want to get us too far on a rabbit trail, but I know with the advent of, AI and being able to use AI to help with our notes, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a question that's coming up, oh my goodness, so often. And I love it because I do want to challenge myself, challenge us as a whole to, advance with the times. I don't want to be that person that's like, no, it has to always be this way. However, I feel like we just don't know enough yet, or at least I don't know enough yet. Like, where is that information stored? Who eventually, within cyberspace, like who could have access to that? How secure is it? I want those questions answered before I start to feel comfortable with
Mm-hmm.
using AI for documentation. But, going back to that proofreading piece, if it is something that you're already doing, because, lots of EHRs have built it in and we just kind of have to roll with it if that's the case, you really, really need to go back and make sure that what is written in there is factual. It is
Mm-hmm.
actually what happened. And that's what I fear is, we're already moving so quickly that when we write our notes, we misspell the client's name, or we use the wrong client's name, and we're not even picking that up. So when AI allows us to move even faster, are we then taking that time to go back and check and make sure for accuracy? I mean, it is
Mm-hmm.
our ethical requirement and our legal requirement to do so.
Right. And another area that I think we're probably seeing a little bit more of, and I guess it depends on where you're located, but the whole thing around medical necessity, particularly if you're an insurance-based practice. Yeah.
Yes, an insurance-based practice. And, I get that question a lot for self-pay, cash pay based practices too, of just like what should
Mhm.
go in the notes for those practices. And, I kind of follow the same guidelines as for insurance-based practices, just because that's what's going to be really sound. That's what's going to give us the leg to stand on, is if our documentation does include, for instance, that those medical necessity pieces. But the really tricky part is, our insurance manuals will spell out kind of what needs to be in our documentation and in our notes, but they also spell it out in kind of a vague way, like saying, you have to document medical necessity. And it's like, well, what does that mean? So
Mhm.
I will often, kind of follow the guidebook or the standard of making sure that when you're assigning that diagnosis, you are documenting some symptoms to back that up. When I'm working
Mhm.
with our therapists, I'll often say, like, if you're struggling with that, you're assigning a PTSD diagnosis, pull out the DSM, make sure that, hey, yeah, there are some criteria here that are being met, and document that, right? Just
Mhm.
document the list of symptoms. And, kind of like going through all of our diagnostic criteria. How long have the symptoms been going on? Are they actually meeting, the 6-month time frame, the 3-month time frame, whatever it might be? And then
Mhm.
how is this impairing the client? In what ways are they limited as a result of these symptoms? So I kind of look for those 3 big pieces. Of course, there's always ways to like add more information, but like bare bones, I think that's a great starting point to make sure that there's some medical necessity captured.
Yeah, 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 and I think it's just a matter of, tweaking your language a little bit with your notes as far as being at least my understanding of it is that you want it to be symptom focused in your subjective, you know, portion of a note. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And again, like we have the DSM at our disposal. I know it's a big, hefty book, or if it's, you have a digital copy, you're scrolling and things like that, but it's there, right? We don't have to play a guessing game. We don't have to, figure out, oh, what would this diagnosis be? We have a general idea. We can go right to that reference material and
Hmm.
see and make sure and double check. And I think that not only helps our documentation, but also obviously helps like our care of the client. If we aren't giving
Hmm.
them an accurate diagnosis, we might be treating them completely inaccurately.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. How much pressure do you think we need to make on ourselves around being able to show progress with a client and all of those kinds of
Mm.
things? Because I know I'm sure a lot of us have had long-term clients that have been coming for years, and really more of the more the focus is on, just personal growth and having someone that they trust that they can talk to about their life and what's going on in general. And yeah, I'm sure those are questions that come up for people as well.
For sure. Yeah. It's like the $1 million question, right?
Hmm.
How do we still continue to justify with medical necessity some of those clients that are here for more of just the personal growth and for like maintenance? And I don't have the best answer for that because obviously like our insurance companies, again, if you're an insurance-based practice, are going to want to see like the impairments, right? The symptom they're going to want to
Hmm.
continue to see, unfortunately, I'm just going to put it bluntly, like some struggle. And not all clients are going to be in that space, especially in outpatient private
Hmm.
practice. I mean, that's
Hmm.
that's kind of the gist of who we see are people who are generally stable. Maybe sometimes they're going through some life stuff and we help them through, but they stay in services to just maintain. And with that, I definitely have a couple of those clients myself. And I think it is about just making sure that you're documenting like when things do come up, it gives you a little bit of a leg to stand on, right? So documenting like what are the symptoms that came up as a result of whatever that stressor is. I
Hmm.
also think it's helpful too, like you're documenting the progress and you're documenting the maintenance, but nobody's perfect 100% of the time, right? So whatever those goals are, if there's a little point in time where maybe they're having trouble or there's some barriers there to that maintenance goal or to that personal growth goal, document those barriers because it's at
Hmm.
least showing they're not able to continue to grow or grow at the pace that they want because of X, Y, and Z. So documenting the barriers can be a good way to continue to sort of justify the treatment, which
Hmm.
feels icky, right? It feels icky as therapists because we want to help people when they're going through the broad spectrum of different things, when they're at a great point in life and when they're at a not so great point in life.
Right, right. So as you think about, just kind of the whole world of compliance, what are some other things that come to mind for you and just thinking about things we need to be, as I like to say, have on the radar?
It's going to be kind of like a catch-all, but I think it's like trying to be aware of what you don't know. So going to that like constant evolution of just learning and seeking out trainings, and for practice owners, like providing your therapist with training, not just on the newest modalities and things like that, but also on like what are some of the trends in documentation? What are some of the things we need to be aware of in terms of keeping PHI private and secure. So this goes back to, we're all supposed to be taking some kind of like HIPAA training on a regular basis. So I think continuing with that so that we do continue to learn and understand and learn again and relearn all of these different facets, because especially is, I mean, you could spend a lifetime truly trying to understand every piece of it. And so I think that there is, if there are like HIPAA breaches, a lot of the times I like to think it comes from just like not knowing, not that that's an excuse, and we don't get to use that as an excuse, but it happens. You just don't know. I didn't know that doing that was going to lead to a HIPAA breach, or I didn't think about, I wasn't aware of how that could lead to a HIPAA breach. So I think just continuously seeking out more information, even though it's not the most glamorous, is helpful for all of us.
Right, right. Well, I know in the past when I've talked with people about HIPAA, because it is an anxiety producer for a lot of people, and we've always heard the term HIPAA compliant, but I've also heard it said that maybe a better way to frame that is saying things are HIPAA secure rather than HIPAA compliant, because unless it's changed when they wrote the HIPAA law, what was it, 1997, 95, something like that. They told you what needed to be done, but they didn't say how. And so, yeah, and so we're kind of less there's a lot of room for interpretation with that. And I think probably the biggest thing is just for a lot of people to just use your common sense in thinking about, okay, how do I keep things private? Because, confidentiality is the cornerstone of our profession as mental health providers. And so just thinking about it in that way, I think is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I like that switch from HIPAA compliant to HIPAA secure. I was once in a training that talked about how there's truly nothing that is HIPAA compliant, like quote unquote HIPAA compliant. And it's like, what do you do with that? Right? What do we do with that? Because there's so many different, programs and things like that out there that are marketed HIPAA compliant. And we kind of go with it because we trust that and we trust that marketing tactic, but we don't maybe really even know what that company, what that brand means by HIPAA compliant. So we do have to kind of do a little bit of our own investigating to make sure, are they using encrypted channels, and, do they have BAAs where they need to have BAAs and things like that. And I think, bottom line, we were talking about documentation and moving too quickly, and even, this area and figuring out like what is truly HIPAA secure or HIPAA compliant. I think the theme here is just like, slow down, right? We need to slow down and really pay attention to what we're doing, the decisions that we're making to make sure that we are ensuring that confidentiality and our clients' privacy.
Right, right. Yeah, it can be, I think we can overcomplicate the whole HIPAA stuff and also the compliance stuff, and that, you just follow and this might be something you want to speak to, Tiana, is follow a procedure or a process with what you do so that you don't let things fall through the crack. You want to say some more about that, about setting up processes or systems and processes, as we like to say, around all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And a lot of times those processes, those procedures, the way we do things come from recognizing we've been doing things wrong. And a lot of times, especially if you're in, a group practice, if you're running a group practice, you're needing to pay attention to like, what are those things that like, I didn't know that we've been doing it this way and we actually should be doing it this way. And what's your default after that to make sure that everyone is in compliance? It's establishing some policy around it. And then, as the practice owner, once you have that policy in place that says, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and this is how we're going to do it, you're, in a sense, you're much more covered than if you don't have that policy, right? Because you can at least say, hey, my employees are all aware this is the way that this specific process is supposed to go. They signed off on that handbook, and it's not that you're like, it's not that you get off free at that point, but gives you, a much stronger sense of security just to be able to say like, hey, we do have a policy and a procedure for this. This is the expectation. And, from there, who knows where it goes, right? That's just dependent on
Right.
the situation. But yeah,
Right.
developing some really strong policies is a key piece in compliance.
Yeah, and I think in particular for practice owners, it's important to establish on the front end when you hire someone what the expectations are. I mean, even, you know, so what, having something in place around, I don't like the word consequence, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. What are the consequences if an employee doesn't stay on top of their documentation or isn't getting it done, that kind of thing? What is the procedure around that?
Yes. Yeah. When we do definitely need some form of consequence, right? Something that says like, hey, we're holding you to this expectation, to this standard. And if you don't, this could be the repercussion of that. And I think, within that, within that scenario, obviously every therapist is human. They go through things. And I think it's very important and can help to offload the fear around like that compliance word and
Hmm.
compliance practice. It's very important to remember that your therapists are human and your practice owner is human, and especially if it's a therapist that you haven't seen a particular behavior, like they haven't engaged in that behavior before, or it's not typical of them. Before jumping to those consequences, it's like, let's have a conversation. What's going on here? Or if it is a
Hmm.
pattern, have that conversation first, right? I noticed that, every single note, it's 5 days late. What's happening? And it might look like, okay, you just had a couple sessions today, right here together. Let's sit and write the notes and
Hmm.
have them do it in front of you to see where are they struggling, and can you offer some kind of like corrective action and
Hmm.
some guidance before moving into that consequence piece. And I think that really helps therapists feel like seen and feel like, okay, you get it, like this work is hard and there's some struggles, and I'm trying my best, I just needed a little bit of help.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think one of the biggest struggles I see, particularly with newer folks, people that are just coming in, maybe pre-licensed or newly licensed people in our professions, is they want to overdo their session notes. In other words, they're putting a blow-by-blow detail of everything that happened in the session, and that's not yeah, that's not necessary. And I tell my folks that, writing a progress note really shouldn't take you any more than 5 or 10 minutes.
Mhm.
Um, and just being able to complete that note, particularly if you're using an EHR, and I put in a biased plug here for Therapy Notes, who's a sponsor of this podcast, but using an EHR like Therapy Notes, and there are others out there too that do similar kinds of things. They've got the templates that you can use,
Mhm.
and it's really designed to be keep you from having to do too much work in completing a progress note. Lots of check boxes and around interventions and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes, and I think, it's a rough time to be a therapist, but it's also a nice time, right? Because we do have
Hmm.
those kinds of tools at our disposal to make those things just a little bit easier for us. And I totally
Hmm.
agree with you, especially with newer therapists, early career professionals, we do tend to see that over documentation. We also tend to see it just depending on where they've worked. And whenever I'm consulting with like our therapists that we're onboarding, that's my first question to them, because it helps me to get an understanding of like,
Hmm.
okay, this is your style and where is it coming from, right? If your notes are
Right.
3 paragraphs long, I want to work with you to trim that down, because you're working too hard at that point.
Hmm.
Unless it's like a
Hmm.
crisis session, of course. But if I know that they've come from, for instance, community mental health, where, in a PHP, for instance, where you do have to document like every single thing that happened throughout the day, then I know where it's coming from. I know, if they continue to struggle with the tips that I'm giving them, that this is going to be a process, because they've just worked maybe the last 2 years documenting every single thing. And again, I think that
Hmm.
that's really seeing them for like their humanness, that this isn't
Hmm.
going to just be something they can, implement, 2 or 3 tricks for, and they're going to get it right.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think it's important, I guess, as practice owners and all to have, give some guidance on that and really, and I think particularly like you said, asking questions about what is their previous experience, whether that's none or lots of experience working in community mental health, which is a whole different ballgame. I remember when I was working in in that realm, it was just, we got obsessed with documentation because of the utilization reviews and contracts and all that kind of stuff.
Yes. Yes, it really is. It's challenging to go from, a more intense acute setting, PHP, IOP, community mental health, to like an outpatient private practice. And I remember my own experiences. I started off in PHP, and it was that, like, document every single thing that happened throughout the entire, 6-hour day, and then getting
Hmm.
into outpatient private practice and just being like, okay, now what do I write? And it was a
Hmm.
little bit of a training period for me. My notes, probably if I went back in the beginning, were much longer than they are at this point. So, from the therapist perspective, like, have some patience with yourself. You were just
Hmm.
trained for, a certain amount of time to write them one way, and now you're adjusting and adapting to what the new setting you're in might require.
Right, right. Yeah, that's great. Well, Tiana, I've got to be respectful of your time, and I'm sure we could spend all day talking on this topic for sure. But tell folks how they can get in touch with you and find out more about the work you're doing with Allison and the consulting and stuff.
So, if you would like to get in touch, check out our services. We are in the process of launching our website. It is www.privatepracticebydesign.com. And on there, you'll find some information about us, our services, and ways to get in touch with us.
Awesome, awesome. And we'll have links here in the show notes and the show summary for people to get to that easily. So, well, Tiana, thanks for being on the episode this podcast, and hope we get to have another conversation again here soon.